Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Geology 1404. Today is Lecture 11. We're learning about the Carboniferous and the Permian. 2 more lectures following this one, and then your final exam review. And that'll be that. So, you're getting your lab exam. The next time we, well, not the next time, but the time following, we'll do Lecture 13. Then I'll open the lab exam. Then the next time we meet, which will be the following Thursday, the last day of class, I believe it's the 12th, that is going to be when we have our final exam review. The final exam opens and it closes the next day. You'll have 24 hours to take it. Cool? Cool. All right. So last time, which was during Thanksgiving break, if you're taking the class this semester, I was alone in the classroom, but I did upload a lecture about the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, and Devonian time periods. Okay. I strongly encourage you to watch that before watching this. If you are taking the class asynchronously. If you are taking it synchronously, if you're in the classroom with me right now and you haven't watched that, you may be a little lost for a minute, but you can go back and rewatch it later. And then maybe watch this one again for further context. All right, so we're going to start with the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous period was 359 to 299 million years ago. Now, why is it called the Carboniferous? Well, there's always carbon. There's lots of carbon on Earth, right? Yeah. Well, life has always been carbon-based as we understand it. When we say carbon-based, what that's referring to is the organic molecular structure. Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, right? Organic things are based around such structures that require carbon. That's what carbon-based means. So whenever you're reading a science fiction book or you're hearing someone talk about the potential for life somewhere else on Earth, every now and then you'll hear someone say, well, what about a silicon-based life form? I mean, yeah, potentially possible. Where's carbon and where's silicon? On our periodic table. Right, carbon, silicon. Occupying similar spaces in some ways, very different in others, silicon being having more mass, right? More protons, neutrons, and electrons, but having the same number of valence electrons because they're in the same column, right? It is potentially possible that silicon could be the basis for life somewhere else, but not here on Earth. And it would have to satisfy some different. There would have to be some other situations, some different situations than we have here. Silicon doesn't bind as easily with other things like carbon does, for example, okay? So it is possible, but here on Earth, life is carbon-based, sure. But why do we call this the Carboniferous? Not because this is when carbon-based life showed up. That showed up a long time ago. It's because of all the trees. There are incredibly massive coal beds from the Carboniferous because of the sheer unbelievable quantity of trees that were living on the continents during this time. At the end of the Devonian, we see plants develop the ability to create seeds. They're no longer spreading by spore. They're spreading by seed. What is a seed? It's a nice, tight, little protected genetic package that does not require the total 100% presence of water all the time to grow. You can drop a seed in moist soil or water it every few days and it will grow, as opposed to the sporing activity that most non-vascular plants had prior to that, where it required the constant presence of water to survive, like mushrooms do today. Okay? So instead, we get these seeds that develop, and these seeds allow the plants that have the seeds to move further inland away from these sources of water, these consistent sources of water. Rainfall now being enough to sustain them instead of needing to be at the banks of rivers or lakes or the ocean. So we see inland forests start to grow during the Devonian. So here we enter the Carboniferous, and these forests have popped off. They are every square inch of continents, possibly, covered in trees. Imagine looking at Earth from space and seeing that most of the landmass is just green. That's what I'm talking about. Now, this has caused a few things and caused a few things then that we will talk about today. Number one, relevant to us being the amount of coal. The coal from the Carboniferous is what fueled the Industrial Revolution. As a matter of fact, somewhere around 40% of the United States energy is still provided by coal, most of which is from Carboniferous coal sources. There is coal from other time periods, but why would I target a 10-foot layer of coal when I can target a 100-foot layer of coal, right? So a lot of Carboniferous coal is still being harvested right now. Y'all remember the process by which coal is made, right? You get a lot of organic material, plant material, and you put it in an anoxic environment, pile it down on top of itself. It gets buried by sediment. It gets squeezed. It gets cooked, heated, pressurized, right? And so finally you end up with a coal bed. Now, it takes somewhere between 2 to 3 feet of organic material to make 1 foot of coal, possibly more than that even, depending on the type of plant in question here and how well developed your coal is. So to make a 100-foot coal bed, you have to have at least a couple 100 feet of organic material. That's a lot of dead trees stacked on top of themselves and then compressed down, right? What do you suppose this did to the environment, all these trees? Ooh, okay. What do trees make through their process of photosynthesis? Oxygen. They pull in the carbon dioxide, they spit out the oxygen, pull in the carbon dioxide, spit out the oxygen. And so, yeah, you end up with a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. That's going to come into play again later. You remember what happens when you put too much oxygen in your atmosphere and you take out too much carbon dioxide? It gets colder. Maybe you start to see a hint for the future at the end of this particular time period, okay? But here we are with a whole bunch of trees. Now, we separate the Carboniferous into 2 sub-periods, the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian. The Mississippian going from 359 to 323, the Pennsylvanian going from 323 to 299. Now, if you were to go to, say, England and talk about these two, they would have no idea what you're talking about. They do not particularly see the need to separate into Mississippian and Pennsylvanian over there. Most other places do not. Here in the United States, we have substantial layers of rock and coal that we can use to separate those two away from each other. Other places don't have as much data, and it's not really as relevant to them. So here, we do that here, but if you were to go over there, it'd be like the Carboniferous. It's just the Carboniferous. And that's fine. At the end of the extinction in the Devonian, we saw the disappearance of a whole bunch of apex predator organisms. And therefore, a whole bunch of more niches opened up to allow that adaptive radiation to take place. Not only plants were doing well, but we see new types of organisms, okay, or of animal organisms, okay? Insects are going to have a big influence during this time period. Ammonoids, which did suffer at the end of the Devonian, come back. You remember how I kept saying when I introduced you to ammonoids, how I said that they keep getting hit? It's like that Smash Mouth song, right? I get knocked down, but I get up again, right? That's Smash Mouth, isn't it? I'm not going nuts. Pretty sure that's Smash Mouth. But anyways, that's like their theme song. That the trilobites and the ammonites for the longest time get knocked down and get back up again, over and over and over and over. We also see a change in the way that our fish adapt. From the beginning of fish, okay, where we first see the fish that we would call, that you and I would look at today and call a fish, okay, something with fins and kind of swims through the ocean, and a mouth. Even before the jaw, they had jaws. When there were just jawless fish, they had armor. There were a few that had scale-like armor, but it was still armor. And now, as a result of the end Devonian extinction, moving into the Carboniferous, we see a change. The emphasis is less on armor and more on speed. Okay? I don't need the armor to protect my body if I can swim away from the predator first. And this gives me the added advantage of now being able to catch my own prey faster and more efficiently, right? There was more advantage to being faster than there was to having armor. The game has changed, okay? The arms race, as I call it, the evolutionary arms race, okay? So we have our brachiopods. They survived and diversify. The brachiopods now occupy fresh water as well as salt water. Okay, they've moved inland in their own way. The crinoids, which you may recall are those stalks of Cheerio-looking discs with the flower structure on the end. Okay, crinoids, sea lilies we call them today. These crinoids, if it's the age of plants on land in the Carboniferous, it's the age of crinoids in the water. Okay, vast fields of crinoids going as far as the eye could see if you were scuba diving underwater. Okay, tons and tons and tons of them. My paleontology professor for my undergraduate degree, my bachelor's degree, is one of the world's leading experts on Carboniferous crinoids. So I saw a lot of them during my education. Okay, I've seen limestone made out of nothing but crinoid pieces, okay? Just massive, thick layers of limestone made out of nothing but pieces of crinoids. Just like the thick layers of coal on land were developing, these limestones were developing during the Carboniferous in the ocean, okay? We actually did a fun thing one time. We got a whole bunch of these. We went and collected a whole bunch of the loose little round discs of crinoid stock, because they kind of look like cereal, right? And we put them into a Cheerios box, and we relabeled it Dr. Gon's Crinoid Crunches. And we gave it to him for his birthday. It was fun. Okay, moving on. Our reef systems. Before, our reef systems were dominated by horn corals and tabulate corals and stromatoporoids and sponges. At the end of the Devonian, we lost some of that stuff, right? We no longer have our horn coral and tabulate coral dominated reef systems anymore, okay? Instead, what we see is kind of a less, at least at the beginning, reef systems really suffered. We didn't really see big reef systems at the beginning of the Carboniferous because we see a change in the chemistry of the ocean, which changed the chemistry of the calcite that these organisms could use to grow their shells and skeletons. I mentioned either in the last lecture or the one before that there are two varieties of calcite. You've got the calcite that we've talked about, that I introduced you to. And then there's another one, aragonite, is a variety of calcite, but it is less stable. It is more prone to dissolving. It is more brittle. It's not as good. But if the chemistry of the ocean is in a certain way, your organisms are going to be generating aragonite calcite instead of true calcite. And so because it's a little more unstable of a structure, our reef systems don't really get very big. They don't really develop very well, at least not at first, okay? Our placoderms, which were the giant armored fish, have disappeared. They died in the end Devonian extinction. And so there was this opening for apex predator niches, and we're going to see some things occupy that here in a minute, okay? Foraminiferans, which are little planktonic organisms that you've learned about. You've learned about fuselids, right? You've learned about all those other tiny little things, okay? But fuselids was one of the ones that I showed you in a previous lab that I believe most of you have done. They show up in the Carboniferous. They are fantastic index fossils for us to identify a Carboniferous rock because they did really well in the Carboniferous, okay? And there are many varieties of them. The ones that I showed you in the lab that actually have here, these little rice-shaped looking dudes, those are fuselids. These are some of the largest foraminiferans that ever existed. Most of them tend to be microscopic. These are one of the largest species that ever lived. They were Carboniferous. So they were doing all right. If they got that big. Moving to land. There's this is again about that 3-to-1 ratio of plants to coal beds, which tells you how many plants lived during this time. Okay. Now, when I say a tree, right now you are imagining a trunk with leaves, and that trunk is covered in bark, and under that bark is a thick, hard tissue matrix that you have to chop through with an axe or a chainsaw. That's not what trees were like at the beginning of the Carboniferous. We will see those develop here before the end of the Carboniferous. But at the beginning, it was more like what those first plants were like coming out of the ocean, okay? Where they started off non-vascular. They had to stay in the water. Then they became vascular, so they could move away from the water. Then they developed seeds, and they could move even further. But their body structure was more like that of a rose. How many of you have ever taken the stem of a rose and just cracked it? Broken it open? No? Cade, you looked distressed when I said that. Yeah, a rose. Like a flower, you just crack the stem. You've never done that? All right, next time someone gives you a rose, don't do this right away. Give it some time. Let the rose, sit on your counter for a day or two. And then when that person's not around, you can be like, oh, that's what he was talking about, right? Or you could even you don't even have to do that. Just like take some scissors and cut off the end of the rose anyway, like at the bottom of the stem. I think you're supposed to do that anyway. What you're going to see is that there is a thick tissue on the outside, which is providing that rigid structure for the rose stem to support the flower body. But then inside of it is this kind of white, milky, spongy substance. That is what trees looked like initially. There was none of that thick, woody texture yet. We haven't gotten there. It looked more like an large stem with a pulp in the middle. Okay, that's what trees looked like initially. We call those lycopods, these initial trees. And they didn't have leaves either. They had a sort of mossy structure at the top, where this sort of mossy tissues were growing out of the branches and performing photosynthesis, not as efficiently as the leaves that would come later would, but it was a step towards that, okay? So we see the development of gymnosperms later on, and those are the ones that have that thick woody tissue and leaves, right? The pines and all of that we'll see later on. Horsetails, which look like this, would have been what a lot of plants looked like at the beginning of the Carboniferous. Okay? Also, lots of ferns. When you look outside and you find a patch of vegetation, what do you see there? Sure, there's trees, but what else? Birds. Vegetation. Let's just think about the vegetation here, the plants. You may not even give it a second thought. It may not even take a first thought from you right now. Plant. What other plants are out there? When you look at one of those little islands that each has a tree on it out there in the parking lot, what's around the tree? No. What other plants are out there? Grass. See how long it took you to get there? We take grass for granted. There is no grass here. There is no grass here. Matter of fact, grass doesn't even show up until the dinosaurs are almost extinct. There aren't grasslands, there aren't vast prairies of grass until the dinosaurs are already dead. Weird to think about, isn't it? So what were there? What covered the ground? Ferns. Starting here in the Carboniferous, the ferns. Everywhere. Anywhere out there, anywhere in the world that you think about there being lots of grass right now, replace that in your head with ferns. There weren't grasslands, there were fern lands. It's a weird picture to paint for yourself, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, our gymnosperms finally show up at the end of the Carboniferous. What is a gymnosperm? Gymnosperms are plants that are better adapted to high altitudes. What does that mean? They can survive in a wider range. Instead of being restricted to tropics and subtropical zones like most of our plants, like the lycopods have been to this point, gymnosperms can spread further north, south, and up. And so this is why so much of the land is covered in plants by the end of the Carboniferous, and why we end up with a massive ice age. It's because of the development of these plants that can spread further into these extremes, okay? So they have seeds which are still seeds, but I'm going to call them naked seeds. What does that mean? They grow inside of a cone. And so, yes, they are protected inside of that cone. But when that cone falls, dries out, and opens up its pockets and those seeds fall out, those seeds are now exposed. How many of you have ever eaten pine seeds, pine nuts on something? Pine nuts? Really? You don't cook with pine nuts? They're delicious. Okay, here's a recipe. Couscous, olive oil, rosemary, pine nuts. Toast the pine nuts, cook up your couscous, throw a little olive oil in there, fluff it up, throw in your rosemary and your pine nuts, fluff that up. It goes great with salmon, it goes great with pork, it goes great with so many things. Beautiful, super simple, delicious side dish. Okay, but pine nuts, oh, love pine nuts. Okay, literally the nuts that fall out of pine cones, the seeds that fall out of pine cones, they are naked seeds. After they are removed from the pine cone, there is nothing that you need to take off of them. You can just eat them like that, and many things do. What's another example of something that is not a naked seed? How about pecans? You ever seen a pecan straight up off the tree? Doesn't look like the nut. It's covered in a protective shell. Okay? We'll talk more about the development of that later on, but that is what I would not consider a naked seed. These are. We haven't developed yet the ability to grow that protective shell around them outside of the pine cone. So these naked seeds allow these plants to move further inland. Okay? So you get the development of new types of plants. Cycads, ginkgos, okay? Conifers, your Christmas trees that we're putting up in our living rooms these days, right? Those are conifers. How many of you have ever seen a ginkgo tree before? These are what the ginkgo leaves look like. You ever seen these? We have a long record of these, all the way from the Carboniferous. And so people have been finding fossils of ginkgos for so long, and yet they never found a living one. And so for a very long time, everyone thought they were extinct. Until Europeans traveling through China, I believe it was the late 1800s or early 1900s, found a monastery in China, in the middle of China, where they had been keeping a grove of ginkgos alive for medicinal purposes. The seeds and the leaves they were using for medicinal purposes. And they found these ginkgos, where before they had only been in the fossil record, and here they are in China being kept alive by these monks. And now you can go to the plant store down the street. There's one at the intersection of Dixie and 42nd, I believe. And you can just buy a ginkgo tree. They've been repopulated all over the world now. They have homeopathic medicinal things. The sort of thing that a monk would say, oh yeah, that helped, so let's grow more. But there's not really any quantitative data to suggest that it did, you know? Whether it truly does have medicinal purposes, I can't speak to that. I am not a homeopathic doctor, right? I don't take seeds and plants and squish them up and make a tea to heal you. Some of those definitely work, but I'm not qualified to say which ones. But yeah, that's the story of ginkgos. Fascinating. We only have them around today because these monks kept them alive. Now, I hope none of you have problems with bugs, because that's what we're talking about next. Insects got really big during the Carboniferous. The ape, why would they get big? First of all, we also start to see some of them grow wings. Up until this point, we have only had ground insects. Winged insects show up right there in the middle of the Carboniferous. Why would they do that? Let's do that first. Why would insects develop wings?
To get away from those big bugs?
I mean, maybe to get away from predators, but that's one aspect of what?
The trees, too many trees.
Huh?
There are too many trees. They become so big.
Environmental conditions changed. What are some of these things? Could be looking for new food source. Could be needing to get away from predators.
Adaptations?
Yes, these are adaptations to environmental stresses, right? Random mutations, right? That's how it happens. Random mutations, and if the environment is just the right way, it could be a positive or a negative mutation. Positive mutation, insect grows wings. If that insect is living in an environment where flying up in the sky is not beneficial for any reason, that individual will die and that gene will never get passed on. But if this individual that grows the ability to fly, honestly, it's most likely, based upon studying other organisms, initially what probably happened was they developed the ability to glide from tree to tree. That's the way it seems to go for most organisms. Instead of going straight from ground to flying, ground to gliding to flying seems to be the general trend, okay? What possible advantage could that be? An insect that can jump and glide from tree to tree can escape a predator that can't follow it, can chase down prey that it sees in that next tree over. And eventually, when that gets to the point where, yes, it can fly, you have an entire atmosphere that is now yours. Nothing else has flown yet. Can you imagine? I mean, obviously, this insect knew nothing about this. But that first insect that truly flew, the first thing on our planet to occupy the sky. The insects probably never knew how incredibly momentous that moment was. But now here we are, and we take airplane flight for granted. You and I can't fly. We have artificially figured out how. But think about how many flying things have lived on our planet since then. That first insect to do it, what a moment that must have been, right? Anyways, oh, an entire atmosphere that it can occupy. That's a whole new field of niches. Things can live up there. And what advantage does that give? You're up here, you can swoop down, and that air advantage. It's the reason why air combat is so important in warfare now. If you can occupy the skies, you own the ground, right? That's how warfare is now. If you're the first person to get your planes in the sky, you've already won most of the time, right? Same thing back then. If you're an insect that likes to hunt these little yummies that crawl around on the ground and you're up here, they don't see you coming. They can't get away from you fast enough. You got them. So wings on insects, huge advantage. But let's go back to the subject of why things got so big. How big am I talking? This millipede is called Arthropleura. It was 8 feet long. Dragonflies, the size of bald eagles. Why did they get so big? Posit some hypotheses. Throw them at me.
Nothing was keeping them in check.
Okay, so they weren't being hunted, you're saying. Interesting. Interesting. But if nothing was hunting them, why would they get big? If there isn't a stressor on them that would cause them to experience a change, why would a mutation that encourages change be successful? Huh? It's random. Yes, the mutation is random. But if I just now absorbed radiation from the sun that came through that window, changed something in my DNA that would cause my son to have 6 fingers on his right hand. Little Princess Bride reference for anyone there. Would that be a positive or negative mutation in the world we live in today? It wouldn't matter. It would not matter. There has to be some environmental reason for it to be beneficial, right? Why would insects get bigger? Is it in response to an environmental parameter like what you keep coming back to, predation, or hunting their own food? Or what else? Any ideas? I'll give you a hint. It comes back to something that we've already talked about today.
About the trees?
Huh?
About the trees and the carbon?
Okay, follow that line of thought.
So wait, what did you say?
He said about the trees and the carbon. I want you to follow that line of thought.
Because I was thinking that I'm not sure this right. Oxygen to make creatures bigger or something like that.
Yes, that's it. Good job, you guys. Okay, you figured that out together. Well done. It's because of the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. There is a direct tie, a link between the breathing apparatus in insects and how big they are based upon the amount of oxygen available. Insects don't have lungs like you and me. Okay? They absorb oxygen through their skin, through their exoskeleton. There are pores in their exoskeleton that oxygen enters their bloodstream from. It goes straight into their bloodstream from those pores. Okay? So if you increase the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, the breathing apparatus has to adjust its size to compensate. It gets bigger. We have actually experimented with this with houseflies and other insects, okay, where you put flies in an enclosed environment and you give them, enough food to sustain them for a while, right? Flies have new generations once a week or so, okay? Less if there's lots of food available, okay? A fly will go to rotting meat, lay its eggs, and then take off. Those eggs turn into maggots, those maggots turn into flies, and they start the whole process over within a week or less, depending on the species and the conditions. And so in very little time, these people had multiple generations of flies going. And what they did is they increased the amount of oxygen available in this airtight environment, in this enclosed environment. And what they found was that there was an increase in size over generation within these flies as time went on, and they increased the oxygen available to them. Generation after generation after generation after generation. This isn't so much a mutation as much as it is a biological response. But mutations can contribute to that. If there's a random mutation that makes a more efficient breathing apparatus system, for example, a change to it that is successful, yeah, that'll be a factor. But this is a biological response to the amount of oxygen increase. In a similar way, too, if you compared me, my Caucasian body, to that of an Eskimo, an Inuit from northern Alaska or Canada, our body shapes would be slightly different. I am taller, but they tend to be broader, have larger chests with more lung capacity. And this is also true for people who live in tall environments, like the people who live in the Himalayas, tend to have larger lung capacity. Why? Well, for us, it's a little different because of our lung systems. We need larger lungs that can breathe in, that can take in more atmosphere to get the oxygen that we need, right? So someone who lives in a lowland area, is from a lowland culture and a lowland community for generations, will have smaller lung capacity, smaller lungs than those who live in a larger or in a higher altitude community. It's interesting. Biological response. Okay.
So they get less tired.
Less tired.
So like if they're running, the person with like bigger lungs gets less tired.
Well, that has less to do with their lung size and more to do with the saturation of oxygen. So they have trouble breathing when they come down to lowlands, and we have trouble breathing if we go up to them, right? If your body is accustomed to a certain environment, it takes time to adjust. Okay. Now, something that you mentioned earlier, Elam, about not being hunted. The biggest threat to these ground-dwelling insects, besides each other, was actually amphibians. We see the development of amphibians during the Devonian. What was an amphibian? An amphibian came from a lobe-finned lungfish that crawled out of the water. Fish that developed lungs. Yes, as a matter of fact, we still have them. There are fish that can breathe air, as well as have gill sets for breathing underwater. We still have them, so we know that it was true. We know it happened. But they also developed lobes instead of fins. We have those too. Okay? What is a lobe? It's essentially where your bones have thickened. You no longer have the webbing between toes like fish today, like most fish today do. Instead, you've got this big fleshy sort of arm or leg limb around thickened bones. And imagine if you had no forearms, you just had your, shoulder to elbow, and you use those to crawl around. That's essentially a lobe-finned fish. Okay? With lungs crawling out on land, that was the transition from ocean to land for vertebrate animals. Okay? So those lobe-finned lungfish that crawled out on the land eventually become amphibians. An amphibian is an organism that is semi-aquatic. It lives on land and in water, but must lay its eggs in the water. Why? Its eggs have no protective outer covering. There's no shell. If you've ever seen frog eggs, they're very much like fish eggs. Okay? They need the presence of water to keep them moist so that they don't dry out and die. So amphibians are still restricted to water environments, staying near water environments to lay their eggs and propagate. However, at the end of the Carboniferous, something really important happens. The amniotic egg. You know what an amniotic egg is?
A shell?
Yes. It's a shell. It's an egg that has not only a shell, but amniotic fluid. Okay? It has the ability to self-sustain. It has all of the nutrition and water that organism needs to grow inside of itself, enclosed in a hard shell. What does that enable amphibians to do? Get away from the water. And this is where we start to see the first ancestral reptiles. This was a major evolutionary change that caused a whole new group of organisms to diverge away, and we call those reptiles. Hard-shelled eggs, allowing these organisms to move further from the water. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Again, something that we already talked about today.
The trees.
The trees! Bingo! The trees developing seeds, not requiring the constant presence of water and therefore moving further inland. That happened during the Devonian and perfected itself, not perfected, I shouldn't say that, went even further during the Carboniferous. has been replicated in animals. The same change, a hard shell around the egg. If you think of a seed as an egg for a plant, right? A hard shell around that, giving it the protection it needed and the self-contained moisture that allowed the organisms to move further away from water and be less reliant on water. It's the same pathway. Isn't that interesting? The answer was the same for plants and animals. And it happened. How did it happen? Random mutation caused some amphibian's egg to have a harder outer surface. Okay? When it comes right down to it, chicken eggs and bird eggs and reptile eggs, that's essentially a carbonate mineral. Think of it as calcite. You can think of egg shells as calcite. Slightly different chemical composition, obviously not terribly thick, but that's basically what it is. So some amphibian during the Carboniferous got this mutation that caused a calcite coating on top of its shells that it laid, the egg shells it laid. And that allowed this organism to not require itself to lay them in the water. Maybe it laid them on the beach like turtles do today. And as time goes on, because it's a positive mutation, there's not as much competition among babies on the shore, right? Or to lay eggs to find a good nesting ground on shore because all your cousins are laying them out in the ocean, right? Because it was a big advantage, it only went further and further and further, generation after generation, until finally reptiles are like, all right, see you guys, we're going inland. All right, what are the continents doing? During the Carboniferous, we see them all coming closer together. Here we got Siberia. Here we got Laurentia, Gondwanaland, Antarctica, Australia. Here's China. They are all coming closer together until finally, in the middle of the Carboniferous, we have Pangaea. We are still so far before the dinosaurs. We're only just now starting to see the development of reptiles, right? We're so far from dinosaurs, and yet here we have Pangaea already, okay? Bear that in mind. The Wichitan orogeny, yes, that's how you spell that. That's how you pronounce that, I should say, Wichitan, okay? The Wichitan orogeny was Appalachian. That means that it occurred on what is now the east coast of North America. This happened when South America and Laurentia crash into each other to make Pangaea. Right here. This is the east coast of what will be North America, and this is the west coast of what will be North America. So here they are crashing into each other to make Pangaea. That crashing into each other made the Wichitan orogeny here on the east coast. Okay, and then the Alleghenian orogeny happened when Africa and Eurasia crash into each other. Why is that relevant? Well, because here's Africa, and Eurasia is coming in from this way, and they are also going to slam into Laurentia during the creation of Pangaea a little bit later on. Okay. It is really warm and wet for most of the Carboniferous until what happened?
An ice age?
An ice age. There were actually several. And this is why we separate the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian from each other. Okay. There was a mid-Carboniferous ice age. What could have caused that?
The oxygen.
Lots of oxygen in the atmosphere, but what else?
No carbon dioxide.
Yeah, you're pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Normally, natural processes that pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere eventually return it to the atmosphere through volcanic eruptions. However, if plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, what's happening to that carbon? It's what?
Becoming oxygen?
Well, no, the carbon, not the carbon dioxide, right? You're right. What the plants are doing are stripping the carbon away and releasing the oxygen. But what's happening to the carbon?
So getting absorbed, but
It's getting absorbed by the plants, and then what happens to the plants?
They die.
The plants die and get buried and become
Cold.
coal. And what happens to that coal? Nothing. It stays underground. What about out in the ocean? All these crinoids that are pulling carbon out of the water to make their calcium carbonate or skeletons. Gets all that carbon, goes into a crinoid. That crinoid dies, stays on the bottom of the ocean, eventually turns into limestone. Carbon is being locked away in coal and limestones. You okay? Okay. It's being locked away in coal and in limestones. It's not being returned to the atmosphere. There is no cycle. It's being removed from the cycle. And so Earth gets more oxygen and more oxygen and more oxygen. Greenhouse gases go down and down and down and down until finally, yes, ice age. Extinction. Mississippian, Pennsylvanian. In the late Carboniferous, we see it happen again, but much bigger. Much, much bigger. Why? Because those gymnosperm forests during the Pennsylvanian is when they really went off. We see the early gymnosperms in the Mississippian, but the massive gymnosperm forest during the Pennsylvanian. Okay? And so we see another larger ice age at the end of the Pennsylvanian. So this is what the Earth looks like during the Pennsylvanian. The entire southern equator area over here covered in ice during this ice age. There's not a whole lot of landmass at the north, okay? So the whole southern hemisphere here, pretty much, so much of that is ice or chilly desert. There's a bunch here along the equator that is still, yes, kind of wet and warm, but lots of ice present here. Any questions about the Carboniferous? Okay, well, this is where we enter the Permian. Why does that name sound familiar to y'all? We live in the Permian Basin. Why is this called the Permian Basin?
Isn't it like the oldest rock we found here from the Permian?
The oldest rock that we've found here is Permian. Well, that depends on how deep you go, right?
The basin that we live in has stuff from the Permian.
Ah, there it is. Yes. What is a basin? A basin is a low area. Think of it as kind of like a valley sort of area, and a regional low area where water deposits sediment until sediment fills it in. We live on top of a filled in basin that was filled in during the Permian time period. I'll talk more. Huh?
So much like oil.
We'll talk about why all the oil here in just a little bit in a couple slides. For now, though, let's talk about the biology of the Permian. The Permian set the stage for what would come next, dinosaurs. It is during the Permian that we see reptiles really taken off. And we start to see things diverge from reptiles to become what would later on be mammals. Okay? Our common ancestor with reptiles lived during the Permian. Mammals, proto-mammals I will call them, and reptiles diverge during the Permian, okay? So reptiles become apex predators on land. They are still working on the moving out into the ocean. I'll show you, out into the sea. I'll show you that in a little bit, okay? So reptiles, the first big thing that separated them from their amphibian cousins, the egg, the amniotic egg that allowed them to move inland. They moved inland. They started changing other things, preying on different things, hunting different things. Now they have the edge on their amphibian cousins, right? So some other positive adaptations start to show up. What before may not have been necessarily a positive adaptation is now a positive adaptation. A new jaw structure, for example, where amphibians today, think about frog jaws, right? Flat bottom jaw, flat top jaw, no teeth. Just kind of clapping together like this to trap a bug or another small animal or a fish and then swallow it whole. They just swallow whole. There's no chewing action. There's no ripping. There's no tearing. That's amphibian jaws. The new jaws we see in reptiles are chompers. They have bite force. They are for ripping. They're for tearing. They're for attacking a new kind of prey. Where amphibians would just swallow their fish or insects whole, reptiles go in and bite off chunks. They are now hunting their amphibian cousins. Can't swallow those whole. So the reptiles, we see them have these new jaw structures with very large, very sharp teeth. Your amphibians did have these larger amphibians anyway, have some form of teeth, but they were more like pegs, not really specialized teeth in any way. Reptile teeth, slicing, cutting, tearing, specialized teeth. And with their bite force, yeah, they could attack and eat pretty much anything. They were now the apex predators. This, by the way, is Dimetrodon. How many of you have ever gotten a, come on camera, stay with me now. How many of you have ever gotten like one of those tubes of dinosaurs from a museum and like you dumped it out and it's full of dinosaurs and there's this guy in there with the sail? It always bugs the crap out of me when they do that. Just throw him in there with the dinosaurs. He's a dinosaur, isn't he? No. No dinosaurs yet. He is a type of reptile called a pelycosaur. Yes, the largest, probably apex predator in the Permian for a very long time. But pelycosaurs like him, while being reptiles, were not dinosaurs yet. Okay? We do not see them, dinosaurs, show up until the Triassic. Okay? Now, was he an ancestor or a cousin to the ancestor of the dinosaurs? Yes, but not a dinosaur himself, no. Let's talk about that sail. What possible purpose could a sail as big and ungainly as that possibly serve?
Swimming.
What is it?
Swimming.
Swimming? You think he used it for swimming? Doesn't look like it would help much for swimming.
Makes it harder to eat.
Makes him harder to eat. So you think it was for protection?
Yeah, like imagine like trying to fit a whole potato chip in your mouth without breaking it. I feel like that's what happened there.
Trying to fit a whole potato chip in your mouth without breaking it? I mean, why not worry about breaking it? If I'm big enough to eat this guy and I know I'm going to eat him, I don't really cry about breaking him first, do I? Intimidation? Ooh. Remember, they are apex predators, right? They don't really have anything that goes after them to eat them, except maybe each other. So perhaps it's an intimidation display. Sure, that's a good idea. What about a mating display? For similar reasons. For the same reason of, I've got the bigger sail, so you should stay away and don't eat me. Or, I've got a big sail. I'm sexy, aren't I? Right? Could be used for the same purpose. What's another one? We haven't hit on the one that's the most likely. And by the way, it could have done for multiple of these. It could have worked for multiple reasons, but the most likely reason, primary reason for them you haven't come across yet. Not really with the oxygen.
The insects,
Not the insects.
balance.
Not balance. Although, I'll talk about their balance here in a minute. What do we know about reptiles?
They go underground.
I mean, yeah, they can live underground. Not all of them. What else about reptiles? Why does Diablo like hanging out around your necks? It's warm. Because reptiles are cold-blooded. So picture this. You are an apex predator reptile. You need to wake up every morning and sit out in the sun for 30 to 40 minutes before your blood is warm enough for you to go hunt anything. Your prey also, being reptiles or amphibians, need to sit out in the sun for 30 to 40 minutes before their blood is warm enough to escape from you. They have the energy to escape from you. But what if you, or I should say your ancestor, for you to have this trait, what if you have a gene that allows you to have a sail on your back? That sail on your back, having so much more surface area exposed to the sunlight, warms up your blood 10 minutes faster than your prey can. That means that you are nice and warm and toasty and ready to go, and you can go and catch your prey while they still can't move because they're having their sun coffee, right?
Is there like any advantage for being cold-blooded?
An advantage for being cold-blooded? Not particularly, as far as I'm aware. Warm-blooded definitely came around later in evolution. Endothermic is what we call warm-blooded organisms. We make our own heat. You have an average body temperature of 98.6. So do most people. By the way, that's an average. There is some variation. Some people are a little cooler, some people a little warmer, right? I tend to be a little on the warmer side. But an average of 98.6 is the accepted body temperature for a human being. It's different organism to organism. We are endothermic. We maintain that body temperature by burning calories, right? A cold-blooded organism eats something, uses that energy for motion, for growth, but their blood and their metabolism is not maintained by that energy. It is maintained by energy that it absorbs from the sun. I know, isn't that interesting? Be grateful we're endothermic, right? Now, you, as having this massive sail, this guy can get up and get going in the morning a lot faster than the things that he tries to eat. That is a huge advantage. That is why the sail. Now, could it have also been for intimidation or for a mating display? Absolutely. But as a byproduct of the fact that it was already there. It is far more likely that it developed as a random evolutionary advantage because of the ability to warm up the blood faster, and then those other things kicked in as a result of it. Okay? Good job. Good job. Now let's talk a little bit about, someone mentioned their posture, their balance, I think. Take a look at these legs. They're kind of like a crocodile's, right? And by the way, the amphibians are doing the same thing. The legs are not directly underneath of them, are they? No. They are out to the side. They're running like this, like crocodilians do, right? We're going to see that change in our next iteration of reptiles, of organisms, I should say, okay? Therapsids. Therapsids are that common ancestor between mammals and reptiles. It is in therapsids that we actually start to see what possibly could be endothermia. It is very possible that therapsids, which look like this, were the first warm-blooded organisms. There is even some evidence to suggest that dinosaurs themselves, while being reptiles, were not completely cold-blooded, somewhere in between. We'll talk about this more next time we meet, because we'll be talking about the Mesozoic, the age of dinosaurs. But there is some substantial evidence to suggest that, yes, they could have been, at least to an extent, endothermic. However, it is in therapsids that we start to see behavior that could suggest that. Now, what do therapsids have? They show up late in the Permian. Okay, it's from these that are. There are some things that tie this very well to ancestral mammals. Okay, some traits that they have. Vertical leg placement. They no longer do this. They're more out here, and then later on, they are going to be directly under the bodies, just like my legs are directly under my body, just like a dog's legs and a cat's legs and a mouse's legs. And all mammals, vertical leg placement. Okay. They get different types of teeth. Instead of just having the cutting, tearing, slicing teeth, they have those, but also a variety of other kinds of teeth. Next time you're in the mirror, or okay, well, let's imagine this right now. You're looking in a mirror right now. Smile. Look at your teeth. What do you see? What kinds of teeth do you see? Describe your teeth to me.
They're like thin and flat.
At the front, thin and flat. Right? You can call those incisors.
At the back, they're like more hard.
Harder? Probably not harder, but they are thicker, flatter. Right? What do we call those? Claudia, what do we call the teeth at the back of your mouth? The teeth at the back of your mouth, what do we call them? Zara, can you help her out? The teeth at the back of your mouth, what do we call them? Anyone want to help them out? Molars. Yeah, they are molars. And then what's the third specialized type of teeth that we have? Yeah, we only have 4 of them. Canines. We have 3 varieties of specialized teeth in our mouth. Incisors at the front for slicing. Canines for gripping and tearing, remnant of our carnivorous ancestors. And then molars at the back for grinding and pulverizing. We see that sort of specialization starting with therapsids. Okay. At the end of the Permian, believe it or not, there's an extinction. What? Surprise. Not only is there an extinction, it's the largest extinction that we believe has ever happened on our planet. Killed 80% of all species in the ocean and 70% of all species on land. This is the closest we've ever come. Now, this is the number of species. We believe about 95% of everything died. Okay? So if you take into account all animals on our planet right now, and you just eliminate 95% of them, that's what happened at the end of the Permian. Leaving behind only representatives of 20% of everything that lived in the ocean and 30% of everything that lived on land. Just a few of everything. Okay? It's the closest we've ever come to total annihilation on our planet. Okay? Now, what caused this? Still figuring it out. However, it does coincide with one of the largest volcanic eruption periods on our planet's history, making the Siberian traps, which I'll show you a picture of here in a minute. Let's just show it to you right now, actually. Here is what the Pangea looked like during the Permian. Okay, do you see this big orange blob there? That's how big the lava field is from this series of eruptions that coincides with the Permian extinction. If you're looking at this from space, imagine how much lava is there just glowing on the surface of our planet. Now, that much lava output means that there was probably a lot of ash output, a lot of temperature change, right? We don't know for certain if that is what caused this extinction, but it happened at the same time. It's probably not coincidental. It probably aligns with some other things that could have happened as well. Releases of methane, perhaps, that were once at the bottom of the ocean and then degassed out of the ocean. That's one other theory. Okay, hard to prove that, though. There's some evidence, but it's hard to legitimately, without a doubt, prove that is the case. Regardless, largest extinction that ever happened, end of the Permian. The Absaroka cratonic sequence occurred during the time of Pangea. What's happening here? Because of the heating up that occurred during the Permian was a very warm time period. A lot of this inland area, particularly around what are going to be future coastlines, but are currently covered during the Permian anyway, not currently, covered by the ocean, get covered in ocean sediment. That's your Absaroka cratonic sequence. During the Permian, there were lots of deserts. All these yellow areas out here, these are deserts that existed during the Permian. You remember I told you Pangea had a lot of desert in it? Why? Because the more landmass you have in one place, the less water gets to the interior of that landmass, right? It all gets rained out before it gets that far. So we have giant deserts here and here and here, lots of deserts during the Permian. The Wichita orogeny continues, or I should say, it begins, right? So the Wichita orogeny happened actually out here. Okay, this is what set the stage for our current Permian Basin situation. Okay, so this is the Wichita mountain range that occurred out here. because some volcanic islands ran into the west coast of North America, okay? Which, remember, the west coast is out here where we are at this point. All of that hasn't quite developed yet, okay? So the Wichita Mountain Range develops right here. This makes two basins, the Delaware Basin and the Midland Basin, right there, okay? Now, as time goes on, these basins are slowly filled in by sediment. Because they are getting shallower and shallower, lots of living things go to live in them. Reef systems, massive reef systems develop in and around these basins. The Guadalupe Mountain Range is a huge fossilized coral reef. Remember that? Remember I told you that? Well, the sheer number of the things that are living in this basin and dying in the basin and getting incorporated into the sediments of this basin means that as our basin is filling up and those older sediments are getting buried deeper and getting cooked, the hydrocarbons that develop from that past life get stuck in the basin. They can't flow anywhere because they're essentially in a big cup that got filled in. And so that oil stays here, it gets cooked here, it gets made here, and it wanders a little bit, but it can't leave the basins. And so that's why the Delaware and Midland basins have so much oil in them. From the Permian time, the things that were living in the water, that died in that water, that got incorporated into Permian sediment, that's what we're digging down into. That's what we're getting our oil out of, okay? And then the Sonoma orogeny happened, was Cordillera West Coast. What this was essentially where you get gigantic chunks of rock that get thrust over Western North America. Do you remember what a thrust fault is from 1403?
What?
Thrust fault. Zara's thinking hard about it.
Goes under?
Other way.
Oh.
Yeah, it is a low angle fault, very similar to a reverse fault, where instead of having cracks in the rock that's dividing your layers like that, and one side's getting shoved over another, it is between layers of rock, very shallow angle, and it's getting thrusted at that low angle over the rock next to it, over the continent next to it. Okay, so the Sonoma orogeny was a thrusting of material pushing further west or further east from the west. This is far from the only time that's going to happen. There are some ones that come up later, including the Laramide orogeny and some other big ones, the Nevadan orogeny, that are going to be shoving in a similar method more and more material further west. And it is these things piling on top of each other that make what we call the Rocky Mountains today. So the Sonoma orogeny is starting to contribute to that. Okay, the first of many thrusting events that are going to contribute to our current Rocky Mountain sort of configuration of that geology out there. Questions? Yeah.
So you know, like the cattails, right?
Yeah, the cattails. Yeah.
When did those show up, or like at least the ancestors of it did? Was it in this time period? Yeah.
So we start to see things that look like those cattails in the Devonian. Yeah. Cattails are the non-vascular. They spread with seed, but that seed has to be very close to water, which is why you usually see them in swampier areas. Like where I used to live in Maryland, there was a canal. That canal was always choked. All the sides of this canal were choked with these cattails. But you walk 20 feet away from the canal and there's absolutely none of them. They have to live near the water even today. But yeah, they developed around that time. Or the organisms, the plants that were their ancestors that look very similar to them developed during that time. Yep. Any other questions? All right. Well, then I will end the recording here and we can move along with lab time. Again, all labs have been assigned at this point, so you should have plenty to work on.